Good afternoon. I'm Ron French, Associate Editor and Senior Writer for Bridge, Michigan. Thank you all very much for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be a very exciting panel and discussion we're going to have today about Michigan's path to a prosperous future, a virtual statewide discussion. Today's program is an opportunity to explore the challenges our state faces, as well as potential steps forward, as informed by a report released today from Citizens Research Council and Altarum, and also reporting by Bridge, Michigan today. We are pleased to bring together leaders from government, philanthropy, business, and the nonprofit sector to get their insights and recommendations of what can be done to get Michigan back on track. In just a few minutes, you'll hear more about the report and some of its key findings from co-author Ani Turner, Program Director for Health Economics and Policy for Altarum. After that, we'll turn to a panel discussion of experts on some of the main issues facing the state. I'll also begin by asking questions of the panelists and leave time for questions from the audience afterward. A reminder that we are accepting written questions only. Now, I'll turn it over to Neil Hegarty, who is the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation's Vice President of Programs and Chair of the Foundation Liaison Advisory Committee for the Governor's Office. Neil, take it away.
Thank you, Ron, and welcome to all joining us today. We're here for a timely and important discussion about the future of our state. Several foundations recently commissioned a comprehensive data analysis of Michigan's population, economic, and environmental conditions to help answer a fundamental question: what direction is Michigan heading in? As you'll hear shortly, the study conducted by Altarum and Citizens Research Council of Michigan finds that other states are surpassing Michigan on a number of measures: economy, education, and infrastructure, to name a few. Michigan's ability to stay competitive in comparison to other states is in jeopardy. These challenges are not insurmountable, but they do call for bold and explicit action. We have an opportunity to reverse the trends by coming together across government, philanthropy, nonprofits, and businesses in every part of our state. And so we're here today to begin a necessary and important conversation about what we can all do as leaders to get Michigan back on track. We will get into the panel and the data in a few minutes, but I would first like to thank my philanthropic partners on the Governor's Office of Foundation Liaison Advisory Committee and the funders of this report. They are the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, Hudson Weber Foundation, Grand Rapids Community Foundation, W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Max M. and Marjorie S. Fisher Foundation, the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, the Joyce Foundation, the Skillman Foundation, the Ballmer Group, and the foundation where I work, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. I would also like to thank Altarum and Citizens Research Council for developing this study, which is formally being released today. Collectively, all of the funders and all of the partners on this report are sharing the message that now is the time to act. And here's a few ways we can begin. You can download the report, which can be found on either CRC's or Altarum's website. You can work with your community partners to hold discussions about ways to reinvest in Michigan to strengthen our state. We can elevate equitable solutions that make a difference, which we will discuss here today. And we can encourage decision makers across government, business, philanthropy, and the nonprofit and advocacy sectors to work together to take action that will reverse the trajectory that we're seeing today. There is a lot to dig into, so now let's get right into the findings and into the data. Please welcome Ani Turner from Altarum, who co-authored the study alongside Eric Lufer at Citizens Research Council of Michigan. Ani will share the key findings from the study that will anchor today's discussion. Take it away, Ani.
Thank you, Neil. I am pleased to be here representing my team at Altarum and our partners at Citizens Research Council. Eric Lufer, president of CRC, is also here on the town hall and will be available with me to answer questions following the panel discussion. Our task was to characterize where we are as a state and where we're headed along a number of important dimensions, as Neil said. And for many of you listening in today, what I'm going to present and what we have in our reports is not going to be a surprise. It's going to look very familiar. We did not invent this information. We pulled from existing data sources and existing studies and talked to folks around the state But what we did was really pull together and create a comprehensive picture of where we've been, where we are today, and where we're headed as a state. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work that was released today. We have an executive summary and the first two papers in what will be a series of 5 papers. First being population and demographic trends, economic workforce and talent trends. And then in June, we'll be releasing a paper on health, followed by infrastructure and environment. And then finally, public services, our state and local government structure and financing. So the main takeaway across all of these dimensions is that Michigan is losing ground. Where once we were one of the most prosperous states in the country, attracting people from around the country and around the world with very high per capita income compared to other states and other places in the world. Over many years, even decades, we have been losing our competitive edge. Our earnings look lower than average, even in the lower third of states. Our health, our educational performance, and our population growth lags the nation. So these trends look also to be continuing in a slow decline into the future, but there are things that we can do to shift the path, and we're going to talk about some of those. In our reports, there will be more detail on all of the data that I'm going to show you, and we will be highlighting areas of focus, areas of opportunity, areas of particular challenge, so that people can come together with some places to start where the data point to in things to be working on. So let's start with a fundamental component of our future, which is the population and the characteristics of that population. When we think about the path that Michigan's population has been on compared to the rest of the country, this chart really shows a visual representation of that pattern, starting in 1950 and then projecting out to 2050. So the blue line in this graph is the United States cumulative population growth from 1950 on, and the line below it is Michigan. And you can see that we tracked population growth with the rest of the country, even a little faster than the rest of the country until about the 1970s. And then Michigan's population growth began to slow. In the 2000s, we lost population a little bit. We lost a lot of our jobs in manufacturing over that period. And our growth has been pretty flat since then. The dotted lines in this chart are showing our path moving forward. And these population projections, along with all of the population projections I'm going to be talking about, and those that we break down in our report, come from the University of Michigan Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics in a long-term outlook for the state of Michigan, an economic and population outlook that they do every few years for the Michigan Department of Transportation. And these findings, these population projections, came out in the fall, and they incorporate the 2020 census, and they incorporate the impact of the COVID pandemic as well. So as we look out into the future, we can see, again, we're growing at about a third the rate of the country as a whole. And when we get out into the 2040s, our population will actually begin to decline. And I'm going to break that down for you a little bit further. Now, one of the impacts of this lagging population growth, in addition to having an impact on our economic growth, is that we are also losing influence in Washington. We have lost a seat in the House of Representatives every decade since 1970, including after the 2020 reallocation. We had 19 seats, now we have 13. And again, this trend looks to be continuing. A very important aspect of the population story, beyond just the top line numbers, is the aging of the population. We're losing population in the younger ages, and all of the growth is really coming from the population of retirement age 65 and older. So this bar chart here is showing change in different population age groups from 2020 to 2050. And over that period, we can see we're projected to have fewer children, have fewer young adults of college age. The prime working age population from age 25 to 64 is actually projected to decline in the next 10 years or so, and then pick up a bit and end the 30-year period just a little above where it is today. But it's really the older population. We're an older than average state, and we're getting older as the baby boomer population ages. So within the 65 and older retirement age population, today, it's the young retirees that are the larger group, the 65 to 75-year-olds. But again, in a decade, as we all get older, the 75 and older will become the larger of the retirement age groups. And by the time we get to 2050, Michigan will have almost as many people age 75 and older as we have school-age children. Another way to look at this information is to look at the ratio of the number of people of working age to the number of people of retirement age. And in 2010, there were about 4.5 people of working age for every person of retirement age. By 2035, that number is going to fall to 2.5 people of working age for every person of retirement age. So clearly this has implications for our workforce, for the customer base in the state, for our tax base, and for the people that are there to provide the services needed to an aging population. So I'm going to break down the components of these population projections because it's informative when we think about what's happening and what we might be able to do about it. So there are 3 basic components to population change. One is the current population and how many people are being born and how many people are dying each year as that population moves through time. That's called the natural increase in the population. So when we look at the natural increase in Michigan's population, we currently have more births than deaths. So the natural increase is adding to the population at the moment, although the COVID-19 epidemic obviously had an impact on that. We had many more deaths than usual, but recovering from that, natural increase is still positive, but it's getting smaller. As we get older, there are more deaths, there are fewer births, and by 2040, there will be more deaths than births, and the natural increase in the population will begin drawing down the population. The other way a population can grow and change is through people moving into and out of the state. So when we look at domestic migration, people moving into or out of Michigan, this is the bar chart on the left. Domestic migration tends to draw down Michigan's population. We've been losing population to other states on net for a number of years. And over the projection period, that's expected to continue. And you can see that there's variation in this net loss to domestic migration over the projection period out to 2050. And that's because the population models used by RSQE also are integrated with an economic model. And as economic conditions change and are projected to change, the influx of people from other states goes up and down. And so you can see the negative is a little lower in some periods than others. I mean, what this tells us is that economic opportunity does provide the potential to draw more people in, and there is significant fluctuation in these population movements. When we look in the chart to the right, this is international migration. So international migration has historically been a net positive to the Michigan population, and that's projected to continue. The numbers that I'm showing you today assume a return to historical levels of international immigration after a setback during the pandemic period. Michigan typically receives about 2% of the total number of international immigrants coming into the United States. So these projections include a baseline set of assumptions that the US will see about 1.2 million international immigrants per year, and then a little over 20,000 of those will come to Michigan. So over the 30 years between 2020 and 2050, domestic outmigration is projected to cause Michigan to lose about 270,000 people, whereas international migration is projected to increase the population by more than 600,000 people. However, by the time we get to the mid-2040s, the decrease in natural increase and the decrease due to domestic migration will not be will be offset by international migration. So the total population will begin to decrease in the mid-2040s. I'll pause here just for a moment and make the point that all of these population movements and trends that I'm talking about for the state as a whole play out differently, of course, within the state. And again, in the report, we show a map by county, and we want to just recognize that some parts of the state are growing and will continue to grow over the next 30 years. And some parts of the state are already losing population. And so when we think about strategies for retaining population, for attracting population, and we think about it in terms of particular places around the state on the ground, we need to be mindful that the strategies are going to vary depending on whether an area is already growing and has certain needs based on the growth in the population and whether there are enough services to handle that growth versus different kinds of challenges in parts of the state that are already losing population. So the final characteristic of the population it's very important to understand when we think about where we are today and where we're headed is the racial and ethnic composition of the population and the increasing diversity of Michigan's population. This is a trend that we're seeing throughout the country. It's definitely true here in Michigan. As recently as 2010, nearly 80% of Michigan's population was non-Hispanic white, but the white population is getting smaller over time. The populations of color are where all of the population growth is projected to come. And this is the Hispanic population. The Black population is growing steadily and maintaining its share of the population. And the group that is referred to as other in this graphic, these are data from the population projections that we've been talking about throughout this presentation. But included in that other category are the Asian population, the American Indian population, people of more than one race. Those are the populations that are really growing. And by the time we get to 2050, nearly 40% of Michigan's population and 40% of the working age population will be populations of color. This is a particular importance and urgency when we think about, again, our economic growth and prosperity, when we understand that in terms of many important life outcomes such as health and education and earnings, populations of color have historically been challenged, been disadvantaged, and are furthest behind in many ways. And so it will be increasingly important to dedicate attention to closing those gaps. So I'm going to turn to talking a bit about economic measures and give you a bit of a preview of the health paper that will be coming out in June and looking at some metrics around the health of the Michigan population and the path that is on. So looking economically, again, we go back to 1950, Michigan's personal income per capita was 11th in the country. Today, however, in many of these sorts of economic metrics, median household income, personal income, we're below average, and in fact, we're in the lower third of all states. This chart is showing income in 2018 and in 2021 for Michigan and many of our neighboring states and the US as a whole. And we compare kind of unfavorably in terms of our per capita income to the nation as a whole and to many of our neighbors. As we look forward to projected population losses and losses in our working age population, and as I'll talk about in a minute when we look at our educational attainment, it's likely that this trend will continue in a downward direction without change and intervention. So a very important factor when we think about earning potential and jobs is educational outcomes. K through 12 educational outcomes, readiness for college or some post-secondary education, and the share of the population that has a post-secondary degree, either a college degree or some other type of post-secondary education. Michigan is currently in the bottom third of states for attainment of a college degree. And our K through 12 system is also struggling. Many of you may have seen the statistics that came out recently looking at standardized test scores for Michigan and other states. Most states, including Michigan, have suffered some setbacks after the pandemic, but we seem to be falling even further behind, and the disparities in educational outcomes seem to be widening. This is showing percent of K through 12 students scoring at or above proficiency in reading and in math at 4th grade and 8th grade. And again, we lag the nation. We're in the lower third of states in proficiency in K through 12, as well as in the share of the adult population with a post-secondary education. Again, as in many of the metrics that we are tracking in this study, there are disparities geographically and there are disparities by race and ethnicity. In education in particular, this graphic is showing educational attainment for major racial and ethnic groups in the state. The teal colored bar on the right of each grouping is showing bachelor's degree or higher. The white population, about a third of the adult 25 and older population has a college degree. For the Black population in Michigan, it's just under 20%. Hispanic or Latino, it's just over 20%, and the Asian population is nearly 2/3. So we see stark differences in educational attainment, and this is a critical metric because educational attainment is strongly correlated to earnings and to where all the growth in jobs of the future are coming. When we look at states and their per capita income and states and their share of the population with a post-secondary education or with a bachelor's degree or higher, again, there's a very strong correlation. And employment forecasts show that the growth is going to be much faster in jobs that require a college degree for the entry-level positions. And we can see, Michigan is among states with low levels of both college degree attainment and per capita income. So I'm going to again give you a sneak peek into some of our health metrics. Like the story in many other dimensions, Michiganders are in poorer health than the national average, and the gap is increasing over time. When you look at measures of overall health, like rates of chronic disease, life expectancy, self-reported health status, are you in fair or poor or good or excellent health, the number of days people report being affected by poor physical health or poor mental health, we're below average across all states in all of these metrics. And in fact, there's an organization called America's Health Rankings that combines a lot of these measures of overall health outcomes into a single metric and then ranks states according to health outcomes. In 2018, we were 32nd out of 50 states in health outcomes. More recently, we've gone between 39th and 40th. So we're lagging the country in the health of our population, and the gap is widening. When we look at rates of chronic disease, as in this graphic, obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, the blue bar on the left is Michigan, we have higher rates than the national average, and we also have more people with more than one chronic condition. We also have higher rates of disability. There are ways in which we compare favorably to the rest of the nation in terms of drivers of health outcomes. And one is in our traditional healthcare infrastructure. We have many world-class healthcare facilities. We have more than the average number of physicians per capita, and we have a high degree of healthcare coverage compared to other states. We've always had a strong history of employer-sponsored insurance. We expanded Medicaid under our Healthy Michigan program. So we have low rates of uninsured, again, compared to other states. But access is not available equally across the state. We know there are many parts of the state that lack many types of important providers. There are still financial barriers to care for some. And when we look at public health spending, Michigan is actually in the bottom 10 states. We rank 40th for public health spending per capita. When we compare our health, not just to the nation, but to some of our Midwestern neighbors, this is number of days of poor physical health per month on the left and poor mental health on the right. The bar on the far left is Michigan, and the other bars are some of our neighboring states. The line across the middle of both graphics is the US average, and you can see from number of days that we are affected by poor physical health on average, it's 3.3 That's the highest. There's one other state at 3.3. Everyone else is below that. And mental health, we're at 5.3 days per month impacted by mental health on average, according to survey data. That's the highest among this group of states and considerably higher than the US average. And again, disparities in health by race and ethnicity. This is infant mortality. The infant mortality rate for Black infants is 2.8 times the white rate. For American Indian children and Hispanic or Latino children, it's 1.5 times. Life expectancy for Black Michiganders is 6 years lower than the Michigan average. So these disparities in health begin young and continue throughout the lifetime. And again, we know that the story is not the same throughout the state. This is life expectancy. It varies by as much as 8 years by county. And when we go down beneath the county level, by neighborhood, life expectancy can vary by as much as 29 years across the state. So that kind of gives you a flavor for the information that is in our reports. And I encourage those of you who are interested to take a look at the reports themselves. And let me just close by saying, again, the trends that we've been talking about, as you've seen, did not happen overnight. They've been building for decades. And there is an opportunity to shift the path. There are many things that can be done. When we look at population movement, more than 7 million people move around the country in a given year, move from one state to the next. Here in Michigan, prior to the pandemic, about 150,000 or so Michiganders each year moved out of the state, but we had 130 to 140,000 people coming into Michigan from other states. So whether we're losing people on net or gaining people is really at the margin there. Are we losing 10,000 people or are we gaining 10,000 people? So there's a lot of movement. There are 1 million or more immigrants coming into the United States. We currently receive about 2% of those. So there's an opportunity to build the population through this kind of movement. And there's an opportunity to keep more people here in Michigan, and importantly, to invest in Michiganders, in our education, in our health, and in other outcomes. Next slide, please. And we also know that focusing on investing in Michiganders, focusing on Michigan as a place to live and to work, both helps to keep people here, helps improve the lives and the well-being of those of us who are here, and helps to attract new people from around the world. So these goals are overlapping and mutually reinforcing. We also know good ideas already exist, and people are already working on these issues and have been in government, in philanthropy, in the nonprofit sector, in private industry, in the business sector, in communities around the state. So our hope is that this work will provide a common set of facts and a common understanding around where we are and where we're headed, so that people can come together and work now and sustain efforts into the future to change our trajectory. So with that, I will turn it back over to you. I'm looking forward to hearing what the panel has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ani. Boy, that was fascinating and optimistic, just a little bit scary at times. We really have a treat for you today. We have 5 panelists who are just true experts in their field, and I'm very excited to hear their thoughts on these issues. I'll introduce who our panelists are, and then we'll go through some questions. A reminder that if you have questions, to put it in the Q&A format in the Zoom. Our panelists are Gabe Rodriguez-Garriga, Vice President for Strategy at Business Leaders for Michigan; Susan Corbin, Director of the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity; Amber Ariano, Executive Director of Education Trust Midwest; Jalan White Newsom, who is Senior Director for Environmental Justice in the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and is a Detroit native; and Frank Etowagishek, who's Executive Director of United Tribes of Michigan. So let's dive right in. Gabe, if I could hit you up first here. Gabe, your organization, Business Leaders for Michigan, recently released its own report on some similar types of issues that are facing Michigan. Would you give us just a brief rundown from hearing about today's report? Were your findings similar or different from today's report?
Thank you, Ron, and I appreciate being here. I would say our findings are very consistent with the report on historical trends. The data is the data. Our report looked particularly at the income gap that has occurred between the U.S. and Michigan back in 2000. Michigan and the U.S. had similar per capita incomes. Since then, this gap has grown, and now U.S. per capita income is about 20% higher than Michigan per capita income in the last 20 years. Really, we double clicked on that to look at what caused this, and it was really a decline of manufacturing jobs in Michigan, as well as a lack of new knowledge economy jobs, where the U.S. lost some manufacturing and grew in knowledge economy. Michigan lost in manufacturing and had 0% growth in the knowledge economy versus 35% growth in the U.S. average. These knowledge economy jobs are engineers, accountants, people work in research and design, marketing. What we see is this really needs to be an and strategy. How can we continue to grow on our strong manufacturing base, as well as diversify our economy into knowledge economy jobs? And core to that diversification into knowledge economy jobs is educational systems reform. Something that was called out in the report by Citizens Research Council was really this: we're lagging the country with respect to educational attainment rate, and our K-12 data is ranked in the 40s. We really need holistic K-12 reform. I will say the one difference in our report versus theirs, we didn't look at projections in terms of what's 20, 30 years. Instead, our report really looked at what can we do to change that trajectory from the last 20 years. We highlighted a framework with 5 key areas. I won't go over them all in depth, but really it's talent. How do we prepare our residents for high wage jobs and attract and retain more talent? Place-based strategy, creating attractive, welcoming, safe communities. Customer service for businesses, cutting red tape, making expanding in Michigan easier. Competitive incentives, really an effective toolbox to help us compete for more jobs around the knowledge economy. And then this entrepreneurial innovation focused strategy to support Michigan's founders and small businesses and entrepreneurs.
Thank you, Gabe. Susan, if I could turn to you, as the representative on this panel who's involved with the Whitmer administration, could you give us a sense? I know this isn't a completely new issue, but I think it's maybe rising in interest among leaders now. Can you give us a sense of how significant this issue is viewed in Lansing right now?
I think, first I wanted to start by thanking the Citizens Research Council and Altarum and all of the foundations that supported this research, because I think many of the issues that were brought to light, in this report and in Anna's presentation are things that we're talking about in Lansing, but not in a comprehensive way that this report brings it all together. So I think this is going to be very helpful for everybody to have going forward. I think these issues have been very prominent with Governor Whitmer. When she created our department, the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, she did so because she felt that it was critically important that all of the traditional labor functions in state government, all of our employment and training activity, our federal workforce dollars, our community development, our housing development, and our economic development, all those parts of state government were together and working very closely together towards the same common goals. When she created this department and we took a deep dive into the data, we knew that we would be facing many of these headwinds. And so we are measuring the success of the work that we do with 4 key metrics. We look at the ALICE rate, those people in Michigan who are asset limited, income constrained, but still employed. We also look at our post-secondary attainment rate. This was brought up in the presentation, and I know many of you are familiar with the early goal that Governor Whitmer set to get 60% of our population with a post-secondary degree by 2030. We're managing a couple of significant initiatives under that goal, the Futures for Frontliners program and Michigan Reconnect, which both programs provide a tuition-free pathway for anybody in Michigan over the age of 25 to get a community college degree or a skills certificate. In Leo, we also measure our success by looking at the median household income. We aspire to be a top 10 state in the nation. And finally, our labor force growth, which includes both helping people re-enter the labor force as well as welcoming new people to Michigan. In our department, we house the Office of Global Michigan and the work that they do to support the governor and make sure that Michigan is seen as a welcoming state. These metrics were based in large part on the governor's economic vision for the state, which was outlined in her My New Economy plan in 2021. And her vision set forth progress towards supporting three strong goals. The first are several goals around growing the middle class in Michigan. The second pillar, supporting businesses. That includes small businesses and women and minority-owned businesses, as well as work on building stronger communities. We know that in order to retain our talent, to attract new people to Michigan, we all need to have strong, vibrant communities to live in.
Thank you, Susan. You mentioned, and also I see that in the report there was a lot of references to education, and how intermingled those are. Amber, if I could go to you, Amber, for laymen like me, and can you describe how the quality of a state's education system, from preschool to K-12 to public higher education, how does that affect growth or economic development?
Yeah, great question, Ron, and thank you for hosting today. I think about this not only from a wonky data perspective, but from my own family's perspective when they came from Mexico years ago for jobs in auto factories, and opportunity that they couldn't get in the rural central Mexico region that they came from. And I think about this, think about it from where Michigan will get its population growth, as Ani laid out, it will be from international immigration. And so you think about that from an immigrant's perspective. Immigrants look for places that will welcome them, affordable housing, and good schools. Those are the three things that they look for first when they decided to settle somewhere, like many families, right? Even cross-state immigration or cross-state migration. And that cross-section of housing and affordability and good education is really a challenge for folks, including native-born Michiganders, because many of those kinds of communities have higher rates of poverty. Communities such as my hometown in Pontiac, but Grand Rapids, Detroit, Lansing, Flint, and the inner ring suburbs have all gone through such deindustrialization over the last 50 years. And these are places that have also really borne the burden of the lack of investment in the P-12 education system. And so these are places that where kids are not being well prepared. And we're not doing a good job in investing in them as a state. When you look at how we rank across the country for investment for low-income students, for example, we're in the bottom of the country compared to other states. And you think about this from an immigrant's perspective, we're also in the bottom 11 states in the country for how we invest in English language learners. So those are ways that Michigan can really strengthen how it's supporting students of color, low-income students of all backgrounds, but in the case of English language learners, for immigrant students and that are trying to acquire English as a second language. One thing that's been really giving us hope this spring is the Michigan Senate's proposals to do historic investments in all those groups of students think if those proposals move forward, Michigan would be making some of the largest investments that it has in both English language learners and students, low-income students in more than a decade. And one thing in particular that is giving us hope is a proposal in the Senate that would actually consider, would create a mechanism in Michigan school funding formula that would begin to consider for concentration of poverty, so that Michigan would actually invest more in students that have a higher concentration of poverty and in their local school districts. And so you think about the lack of capacity in some of these communities where immigrants tend to go and settle, to support students in reaching college and career readiness, so that they're ready to go into a CTE program, or they're well prepared to go to a college. Those are all the kinds of investments that we should be making to boost college attainment, which I know Gabe talked about is such an important issue for us in building the kind of talent base that we need to be successful economically and otherwise.
You know, there are so many factors that influence perceptions of livability in a state. Education is obviously a big one, but also there's the environment. Jalan, can you talk to us a little bit about how environmental quality and justice can affect a state or community's ability to retain or attract residents and retain and attract economic development?
Sure, and thank you so much, Ron, for including me in this important discussion. And as you mentioned, I have the opportunity to lead the environmental justice team at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And so basically my job is to advance President Biden's agenda to address issues that impact low-income communities, Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities. And so when I think about, it's such a privilege to share in this space with Amber, Gabe, Susan, and Frank, who are directly doing work that impacts these populations, that warms my heart. And so when I think about, as a native Detroiter and what I've experienced, I think we have to realize that environmental justice is the North Star. And when I come in these spaces, I don't assume that people know what environmental justice is. So I'm just going to make sure that when I talk about environmental justice, it simply means people having access to clean water, being able to breathe clean air, being able to have the opportunity to grow and thrive, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, or your income level. But most importantly, having a voice in the government, the different levels of government, and that decision making. So when we think about the reality of not only many other states across this great nation, but for Michigan, environmental justice is not a reality for many of our communities. When I think about growing up in Detroit, I knew and I saw many babies that were poisoned by lead, Black and brown babies, depending on where you were in the city. That is environmental injustice. When I think about friends that I have that live on the western side of the state that are dealing with contaminated groundwater from PFAS and leach it from landfills, that is environmental injustice. When I think about, again, those communities that continue to suffer from what we call legacy environmental pollution, so zip codes like 48217 that have been the most polluted and have cancer clusters, people living in these places for decades, that is environmental justice. So it's important to understand what it looks like and why the things that folks are talking about are all related. We cannot have a prosperous Michigan if we don't have environmental justice. And I will say that again, we will not be prosperous if we don't advance environmental justice. So when I think about why it's important to your question is that no one wants to live in an environment that's hazardous to their health. I would assume that. And so as the general public becomes more in tune to the connections between their environment and their health, particularly with what we're trying to do with our administration, is that, again, regardless of your ethnicity, where you live, your zip code, or what's on at the end of your W-2 of the year, we deserve that. That is basic human rights. And so for many years, Michiganders have had a deep commitment to working to advance environmental justice and get those healthy communities they deserve. Because from an economic standpoint, who wants to live in a state that does not address environmental justice, does not believe in promoting the health and welfare of all individuals and all people? And I think about the time that I spent in the auto industry. in Michigan in different plants across this country, because I'm an engineer by training. And basically there was always kind of like this battle, philosophical battle between growing an economy and having an environment that people can live and thrive in. And we don't even need to have that discussion anymore because we can do both. And part of that is making sure that the decisions that we make, again, keep in mind those populations and those folks that have been made most vulnerable by systems that have not had their best interests in mind. And so as this report speaks to many of the disparities between education and workforce and health, the underlying factor, in addition to the environmental injustice that we see, is that structural and institutional racism is the root cause of this. So we have to make sure that we address that before we begin to think about all these other pieces that, again, this report brings out and the reality that, again, I see and hear from communities every day.
That's fascinating, and something that you're bringing up that's been mentioned by, I think, every panelist so far is just the interconnectivity between all these issues, that you can't just decide that you're going to invest a little bit more money in schools and it's going to fix the problem on its own. That all these things are connected. It has to be handled holistically. Frank, I'm really fascinated to hear what you have to say, because you may come with a different perspective on this issue. You live in a rural part of Michigan. Is there a different perspective there about the need or even desire for the kind of population growth we're talking about?
Well, welcome everybody, and it's you know, the issues that that we have in my area in particular. I live in Harbor Springs, Michigan, and we see quite a bit of pressure in terms of there's a lot of development going on. There's new houses being built. There's our development has sort of outstripped the ability for our infrastructure to handle what we're doing here. And so I have a different perspective. I've joked often that several times in my life, I've shown up to my favorite mushroom spot in the woods and found a house built in the middle of it. And this has been a sort of an ongoing thing for us here. And it's at the same time, I have friends in the cities where there's blocks of vacant houses and jobs have been going away. Lots of different issues. In northern Michigan, we were affected substantially by the decline of the auto industry because so much of our economy in northern Michigan was tourist-based and based on folks that were coming up for weekends to the north. One of the things that I need to talk about in this is the tribal perspective on economic development in the state and on where we're headed. Tribes were so poor that we were off the bottom of the charts when it came to understanding our cultures and our citizens back 30 years ago or so. We had to work on a lot of things, one of which was the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver Program, which we got put in place. We're graduating more and more students from that with degrees. We have doctors and lawyers and CPAs and other professionals, engineers, and others that are coming along, and we're building our part of the economy. We're lifting ourselves up, and that helps lift all areas. Well, there are 12 federally recognized tribes in the state. And of those tribes, each one is one of the leading, if not the leading employer in its region. And the people who work for us have benefits and are able to live on the wage that they're making for the most part. We do have some jobs that are lower pay, but for the most part, we've contributed substantially to the economy. And we also contribute by bringing in funds from the federal government in terms of money that comes through treaty-based payments that come for governance and for healthcare. Each tribe, each of the 12 tribes brings in several $1 million a year to our regions. This money is spent on goods and services locally. So there's an advantage that doesn't really show up in this study because we're buried down in that other column. Only once in the study does are Native Americans singled out in a graph, for instance. And I think that that there's an advantage here for the state, that Michigan has this advantage and needs to capitalize on it. There have been some steps taken to do that, but because the tribes are, for the most part, we're all in the rural areas of the state, we see a different kind of we're contributing to the economies in those areas where there is some, we're growing jobs. We went in at Little Traverse, we went from no employees, not on the list of federally recognized tribes. Within a couple decades, we had 1,500 employees and a $30 million annual budget, rivaling a county-sized budget. And so, this is something that needs to be factored in as we look at the potential for what are the tools that we have to grow in Michigan. I often tell people, and I don't like to pick on Ohio, but I do. I say, poor Ohio. They don't have any federally recognized tribes, but Michigan has 12. We bring all this money in, and we also have clout at the federal level because we're able to help bring things here that otherwise might not come. And so we need to form partnerships, say with Susan and with others, the other state departments, to bring these together. And so I could talk a long time on this, but I know we're limited in time, but I wanted to bring those points out because so few people are aware of these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And I think I'm going to go back through all our panelists and try to be and hopefully try to press a little bit on what the state can and maybe can't do to try to work on these issues. And Frank, I'm going to stick with you for a second here. Do you think that Lansing is taking the appropriate level of differentiation in their approaches for economic development between rural parts of the state, like where you're from, and more urban areas?
There have been some significant advances recently in doing that. I know that, but for a long time we felt like we weren't really getting much. But I know that Michigan Economic Development Corporation has been working across the state and working with the tribes, of course, across the state in our development. But there's other things that we need to pay attention to. Education, for instance, has been one of the things that has been looked at. It's not just the inner city schools that are suffering, but many of the rural schools are suffering as well. And we need to increase that ability to give a good education. I think it's important for us to think about that just growth by itself is not necessarily going to give a good quality of life. What we want to look for is a high quality life. We need jobs that contribute to healthy families and healthy communities, building social and community capital, not just money. Money by itself is neither good nor bad, but money by itself does not necessarily guarantee a good quality of life and happiness. And so we need to think about how we balance those, and the programs that come through from the state of Michigan. We fight hard to be sure to be recognized, because we do have, I live in a district where at the federal level, all of the Upper Peninsula, the better part of the northern part of the Lower Peninsula is a single district because of population. So we have one representative there, and then there's so many more in the southern areas. So it's hard for us to be sure to get attention, but I think we need more. But I think that there's been an increasing level of attention paid here in these areas, and I think this effort has been going on through not just this administration, but the last couple have started to pay more attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanne, I know that you currently work at the federal level, but you are such deep ties to Michigan and to the Detroit area. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense from your perspective, obviously, you know, does the state or individual communities in Michigan need to invest more in the issues that you're concerned about environmental quality, environmental justice? Is this a matter of money or is it a matter of effort?
So I appreciate that question, and I appreciate Frank's response that money is definitely not everything, but it does help. And what I will say is that I am really excited to share a couple of the things that this administration is doing that my hope is already and will have even more impact on investments that need to happen in the areas that we need to prioritize, which are those areas that are often overburdened with pollution, underinvested. Typically our low-income folks are Black and brown folks and our indigenous population. So what I will say is there's a couple of things. You know, I think it's important for anybody working in this area to make sure that they understand the problem and the interconnectedness, like education is key, because a lot of folks don't really understand that your environment can dictate your health. So that's the first piece. The second piece is I think we need to be really bold in our actions from a federal perspective, a state perspective, and a local perspective. So when I think about decisions that are being made, whether it be around education, workforce development, the citing of different activities, you got to ask those questions about, are there some unintentional consequences that I'm not bringing into the equation that will be detrimental to some of the populations that, again, don't have a voice, aren't represented, are typically invisible? And then the third thing I think is that what's exciting for me and what gives me hope is that we need the state of Michigan and others to take advantage of this moment. And I just want to speak to a couple of the initiatives that I think, again, will have some really impactful effects on the state of Michigan. One being the fact that our president signed just a couple of weeks ago the Environmental Justice Executive Order 14096. And what this does is basically says that our federal government, every agency, which again, in a way, every federal agency touches the pieces of things that folks have raised in this report and raised on this call, has to prioritize and bring environmental justice into the DNA of how they work. And that's major because that has never been a thing. So we got to take advantage of that and hold, as I tell everybody, hold the federal government accountable for what we're supposed to do to help our states realize the larger vision of this administration. The second thing specifically when we talk about investments is we can all the money in the world and these billions of dollars that have come through the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I can go on. But we can have all this money, but if they don't land in the right places, then what's the point? So part of what we've created is a tool called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, the CJS, you can Google it, which basically designates census tracts across the country as disadvantaged, meaning they have been overpolluted, underinvested, and overburdened. And so what our federal agencies have to do is use this tool to prioritize where their grants and resources and funding streams land. And the Justice 40 initiative of this administration says that we want at least 40% of the benefits of these investments to land in these disadvantaged communities. Now, why I say that is because some of these funds come through formula funds to states. And that same edict of making sure that the benefits land in the communities where we need them to is important. And so I think really activating, again, the spirit behind the Justice 40 initiative, which is not just money, but actually changing the culture and how our agencies operate, is something that at a state level, you can utilize, again, to leverage and fuel the things that need to happen on the ground, which is what environmental justice is. EJ is local, and that's where the change is. That is where the communities will feel and see and taste a difference in their everyday lives. So I'm really excited about those pieces of our presidential agenda, and we just got to make sure that it hits the ground.
Thank you. Thank you. Adding a little positivity to the conversation. Thank you, Joanne. Amber, a lot of people on this discussion have brought up education, and some of the slides, if for people who are not familiar with them, seem a little depressing about where Michigan is, and it makes me wonder if you could talk a bit about. We talk about this, about the population problem we have here, but I wonder if it's, if you're looking at it as a chicken and egg thing, does Michigan have a population problem or an education problem, or are they so interconnected you can't separate them?
Yeah, definitely a both and problem.
Yeah.
I mean, we could continue to have population growth and we could not see these trends, but given our lack of investment, commitment at the leadership level, real the kind of the structures that we need to have in place to see a more comprehensive educational improvement across the state. I think we'd be seeing stagnation or decline anyway. So, and if you, and this is not this has been a bipartisan challenge. I mean, really, if you look back over 20 years, Michigan has had kind of a lack of commitment at the state leadership level for many, many years across different administrations. And in some ways, it makes sense if you think about the Great Recession, for example, 12 plus years of, it's often devastating economic losses, job losses, instability, et cetera. People weren't thinking necessarily about that. They were thinking about, where am I going to get a job? How am I going to feed my kids? The state was the companies were recalibrating and thinking about survival, and the state was thinking about survival and the safety net. So in many ways it makes sense, but we've been past the Great Recession for a long time now. And so we haven't been thinking about a proactive agenda, right? About what does it mean to become a top education state once again? And many of our outcomes were in the bottom, 15 states or so. And we've seen either decline or stagnation again since the early 2000s. So, Gabe talked about a comprehensive or a holistic agenda around talent. And so it's about investment. We've talked about money being part of the problem, but not the challenge, but not the only solution. That's absolutely true. We can pour money into the system that we have, and we should be making historic investments. We haven't made them in well over a decade in the state, particularly for low-income students and English language learners and students with disabilities. But at the same time, we have to make sure that those dollars are going to be used effectively. There's new forthcoming research coming soon in California about the impact that California's investments have made in public education there over the last 10 years or so. But there's also a growing body of evidence there that only about half of the dollars actually invested in low-income students are actually reaching their schools. So if you think about that, we can pour money into the system, but if we don't have the right infrastructure and systems of accountability and transparency and data in place, then, the money can just go poof and without seeing an improvement in outcomes or even knowing where the dollars are going. So there's a lot of work that we need to do right now in that. And I think given the topic at hand, we need to do more work around repopulation, investing in repopulation strategies, and the connection between housing, affordable housing, and education. And we haven't done a lot of that. We haven't done a lot of thinking in that. And again, if you think about where we've been in the last 20 years, it makes sense, but we've been past the Great Recession now for a long time. And we really haven't done a lot. There's not been a lot of investment and strategic thinking around repopulation, around affordable housing. It's particularly that's targeting, say, immigrants, but also refugees. Michigan has some incredible refugee resettlement agencies, some of the best in the country. That's one of our assets. We could be leveraging that, right? And thinking about how do we make great public schools and welcoming affordable housing strategies to welcome refugees. That in itself can be a really smart strategy, and but also not only for the benefit of the state and the state's economy, but for those refugees. Think about the families fleeing Ukraine, right? That need a place to go, and so we could be a place for them to find a new footing in their lives and all the assets that they would bring to our state. So there's just a lot of innovation that can can happen across those sectors at the intersection of policy, investment, education, and housing that we really should be leveraging.
Thank you. Great points, Amber. Susan, going to you, you know, there's certain things about population enticement, you know, like attraction, and that we don't have any control over. Let's be honest. We're cold. We're a cold weather state. That's not going to change unless someone invests on some very large furnaces. But I think that, you know, it's generally speaking, we're a cold state, and that doesn't attract you know, a lot of people. We're a peninsula. No one comes to Michigan by accident. You have to intend to come here. So you have those sort of issues you can't control, but looking at the issues that we can control. Okay, and Susan, when you spoke first time, you mentioned some of the efforts that the initiatives that the Whitmer administration is undergoing here. Can you talk a little bit more about what are some of the areas that agencies or the legislature or the governor's office can impact? And is there a feeling that this is an issue now that even if we're doing the same sort of efforts in the future, we're going to need to invest more?
Yeah, I can do that. First, you know, I want to touch on an issue. Amber brought up some really critical issues. She brought up the issues around housing, and then housing as it relates to welcoming immigrants, refugees, arrivals to our state. We know that in Michigan, well, across the country, really, housing has become an economic development issue. You know, we hear stories of, you know, people accepting jobs in some of the rural parts of our state, but then not finding adequate housing to be able to move there with their families and not being able to accept jobs. So we have in this last budget made some significant investments in housing. We've got a new $50 million fund to help support housing for the missing middle, workforce housing. We also, for the first time since 2014, have put money into a housing and community development fund that rests with MSHDA. We've put $50 million into that fund, and that's going to give us much more flexible tools to help support local communities in meeting their housing needs. But one unique thing that we have done, we had a fellow spend some time with our Office of Global Michigan and look specifically at housing issues as it relates to refugees and immigrants. You know, what are the pain points? What are the struggles? And just recently, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, working with the Office of Global Michigan, has approved a $4 million fund to help supplement housing costs for immigrants and refugees in their first year in Michigan. We know to find affordable housing is a struggle for people coming to Michigan. And so this is our first, you know, foray into trying to work on solving some of the problems that Amber highlighted. And then also to bring real focus to the work that's happening in housing in Michigan. MSHDA has spent time meeting with you know, people across the state. They did some extensive survey work, and they have created a statewide housing plan that now gives us a blueprint in what we need to do in Michigan to meet our housing needs. Frank touched on, you know, the rural-urban divide, and as part of that work, MSHDA is doing a series of regional meetings around the state, because we know that, you know, housing issues that are, you know, being faced in, you know, Grand Rapids or Lansing or Detroit are different than the housing issues that are, you know, being experienced in Traverse City or Marquette or Sault Ste. Marie. So we want to make sure that we've got regional groups who are working on those issues and supporting the work of that statewide housing plan. So I wanted to put that out there first because Amber had touched on such important issues.
Thank you.
But I think what struck me about the report is so much of the research and the recommendation validates, programs that we have started or programs that have gotten so much focus and for some of them, strong bipartisan support in the legislature. First, as I mentioned, the governor's goal around post-secondary attainment and the Office of 60 by 30 and two critical programs, Futures for Frontliners and the Reconnect program. As I mentioned earlier, the Reconnect program provides a tuition-free pathway for a community college degree. We've had nearly 120,000 people in Michigan apply for the Reconnect program. We know that we've got 27,000 people in Michigan already in community college seats. And this program, I think, starts to address the inequities that we see in education. 31% of the people who have enrolled in Reconnect are Black. 60% of the people who have enrolled in the program are women. So, and then also beyond that, we know that in Michigan, a two-year degree, we can't stop with two-year degrees. In the report, it highlighted how many of our jobs of the future are going to require four-year degrees. In this last legislature, the governor signed the Michigan Achievement Scholarship Program. And this just puts Michigan in a totally different place in terms of how we support those people in our state who are pursuing four-year degrees. This program is in place for anybody graduating in 2023. And it will provide, not only support for someone who's pursuing a trade or a skills certificate or a two-year degree, but for those people graduating starting in 2023, it will provide up to $27,000 in support for their four-year degree. We also are supporting other programs that support employers and employees now. Our Going Pro Talent Fund is a program that employers can apply for and receive training dollars for their current employees or employees that new employees that they're hiring. We have made some changes in that program so that there's a greater focus on geographically disadvantaged areas. There's a focus in that program in the quality of jobs that are, being supported with those training dollars. And our data post-training shows that those employees who participate in the training programs on average see annual wage increases of about $6,000 a year. So when we're looking at the ALICE population and trying to raise households out of ALICE population, an increase of $6,000 a year can be significant. We are also, prioritizing programs around supporting small businesses. In this last legislative session, there was support for small and micro businesses. We learned during the pandemic that our small employers in Michigan were, hit disproportionately. And we're working alongside MEDC in creating more programs and stronger programs that support small employers in Michigan. The governor in her fiscal 24 budget has also proposed some Michigan Main Street initiatives, and we're hopeful that those programs will receive support. Also, talking about the rural, urban divide, the governor in her budget has also proposed a regional empowerment program. She's proposed $200 million that would be made available to local communities through grants. And in that program, local communities could come together, as a region. They could decide who their regions are, and they would make proposals of programs that they know could be impactful in their local communities. And we, could support those through grants. So there's quite a bit of discussion in the legislature about, what a program like that should look like. And so, we're very hopeful that that program will be supported in some form so that, local communities could decide what is most impactful for their community, and we'd have a way of supporting them.
Thank you so much. Gabe, I'm going to switch it up here a little bit and ask you something a little broader here, but what has to happen? Characterize how important this issue is to the state, and what do we need to do as a state, as citizens that are very involved in the state, to make sure this report and the report that business leaders from Michigan released last week don't just go on a shelf and collect dust? What do we need to do to keep this at the forefront?
Appreciate that question, Ron. What I would say is that these issues are 40 years in the making. This is not a one administration or two administrations. This is 40 years in the making, so it will take time. And a lot of the actions that the governor and bipartisan legislation did last year and this year is really going to attack these different pieces. And the other piece is that economic development and talent are bipartisan issues with bipartisan solutions. But what I would say in terms of attacking our in-migration specifically and our business growth and expansion, in terms of domestic migration, people move for place and opportunities. So let's focus on investing in place and growing our job opportunities for those individuals. International migration, that's harder because that's a federally set cap on a lot of different programs. But what can we do to be the most welcoming state for those immigrants and to help those immigrants grow and thrive? What Amber mentioned and the different work Susan and Leo is doing around that is really a good start. We also believe in terms of attracting talent, we need holistic K-12 reform by implementing the Launch Michigan framework. We need more funding, yes, but we also need accountability and we need additional support for our teachers on that. In terms of place and what talent wants, we need to create a statewide housing and community development strategy, as well as hardening our infrastructure and expanding transit solutions. When you looking at business growth, opportunities for individuals, we really see it as we need to support site preparation, 50 small, medium, and large sites across the state. We look at a map and saying, let's get sites in all these different communities. We need to maintain our regulatory certainty and have predictable processes that are efficient. Business thrives on consistency when it comes to regulation. In terms of entrepreneurial innovation footprint, we need to focus on our founders, entrepreneurs. We have great support centers for innovation, incubator spaces, anchor institutions. You look what's happening at the Medical Mile in Grand Rapids or the Corktown Innovation Center in Detroit. How do we continue to support and grow that? And the last piece on getting businesses to come here is this is a competitive game. Businesses are looking to place their investments in other areas. We need more tools around the knowledge economy. Michigan's one of 10 states without an R&D tax credit. We also don't have a payroll tax credit, which makes us an outlier in terms of competitive states. And we need consistency in these incentives. When businesses thrive on consistency, and I think that's critical, and other states have maintained their incentives and their policies for 10 plus years. And historically, Michigan has been a little more inconsistent with theirs. So how can we be more consistent when we come to incentives?
Thank you very much. We want to turn to questions from the
Ron, I can't hear you. I don't know if anyone else lost your.
someone muted me.
Okay,
That happens a
there you
lot.
go.
That happens a lot at my house, but normally not. With a button. No, but we want to turn to audience questions for a few minutes here. We've been getting a lot of great questions, and because we're running short on time, let's try to keep answers to 60 seconds or less, and so we can get through a few questions. First question I have here, and on the panel here, it might be Gabe who has the best suggestion for this, but anyone else feel free to chime in if they know. The question is, do any of these population models that we're talking about when we're projecting forward, do they take into account the impacts of changing climate in the US? In other words, if we hold on long enough, will people start moving here because the climate's better? I know the BLM report did not do projections, but Gabe, do you know about whether that's true or not?
I know Ani came on screen. Do you want to touch that one, Ani?
Yeah, Ron, I would say we've identified that as an area of potential opportunity. I don't believe that RSQE's projections model currently has any major assumptions about new people coming due to changing climate. But in the report, we do call out in more than I did, I think, in the presentation, that this is an potential opportunity to capture more people moving from coastal areas, moving from areas with more extreme weather. This part of the country and this part of the world may well gain population in the coming decades, and we need to be in a position to try and compete for that.
Okay.
But I don't think it's in those projections right now.
Okay, thank you. And Ani, this may be to you too. And if it isn't, maybe someone else has an answer. What is the makeup of those leaving the state compared to those who are coming to the state?
Gabe, do you?
I actually have some good data on that one, Ron.
Thank you.
Which is, so we looked at talent, and mainly the talent that leaves the state is younger talent. So talent under 25 is mostly leaving. We actually looked at a specific correlation with Chicago. For the last 10 years, we have a net movement of, we've lost 6,000 18 to 25-year-olds, but we've actually gained 6,500 25 to 64-year-olds. So we're a slightly net gainer compared to Chicago, for example. That's just one, but it's actually very typical in terms of what we see is young people leaving, and then some come back from most different areas.
Okay, thank you. And here's a sort of a general question. So anyone chime in? Because we had this from several members of the audience, and I know this isn't a particularly specific data question, but it's interesting. We keep talking about population stagnation or decline and what it could mean. What is the optimal population for Michigan? I mean, is there reason to believe that we have to go up to 12 million to be a economically feasible state? Can we be economically feasible at 8 million, but with a more educated state than we have now? Is population too blunt of an instrument for economic development? Anyone want to chime in on that?
This is Frank, and I just, reiterate that the quality of life is a critical factor, and that also helps to bring people into the area. And so population, if the growth is not planned, and if it's it can interfere with that quality of life. And so I think that it's a two-edged sword that we have to think about there.
Thank you. And this may be for either Amber or Susan. Is there any evidence to support the idea that greater public investment in childcare services would promote higher natural birth rates, which would help our population, or entice more workers to either stay in the state or come to the state?
So I'll just add a couple of things. I'm not familiar with the research on that. I think if you look at media coverage through the pandemic from working mothers' perspectives, there has been a really interesting, consistent coverage of that issue from working women's perspective, even anecdotally. Some suggesting there's a trend of younger American couples moving to countries where the infrastructure is more supportive of working mothers. So maybe Susan knows what the research base is.
Well,
interesting, just the media trend has been interesting to watch. So
well, we know childcare prior to the pandemic. We had childcare issues. The pandemic just only exacerbated issues around childcare, access to quality, affordable childcare, but then also the low wages of those people that are employed in childcare. But one data point that we do have is that over 200,000 women left the workforce in Michigan during the pandemic. And we know that women leave the workforce because they are the caregivers, whether they were taking care of the children in their household or they were taking care of other family members. And we saw that women returned to the workforce at a much slower rate than men did And then I think the last time that I saw the data point, there were still nearly 130,000 women who have not returned back, who have not returned to return to the workforce.
That's amazing.
Ron, can I just circle
ahead.
back to something you said about this question of, is the better path accepting that we're going to be a smaller state?
Please.
And I think it's like, it's not an either or, it's a both and. And I say that because the truth is that that is probably what's going to happen. Right. And so I think the tide, the demographic tide is going against us in that way. Right. So, or for you, if you think that that's the right path, but to just accept that and not think intentionally and strategically about repopulation and becoming a welcoming state and investing in our talent base, et cetera, doesn't seem to be like a prudent path either. And I say that, you think about the infrastructure that we have to support this across many sectors. Think about the number of aging Michiganders that in 20 years will need services, right? And not having people to do them. There was a story in the New York Times on Sunday about Japan's population loss. I'm not sure if you saw that, but that there are hundreds and even thousands of houses for sale. It's going as little as $10,000 and $20,000 because the population is aging so rapidly, and there's just no one to buy their houses. And so the property values crashing in whole regions of the state because of this. So I think we probably will be a much smaller state, but we also need to be intentional and strategic about investing and becoming more welcoming and embracing who we will be. And that is a much more diverse state. If we're lucky, we will be a much more diverse state, and we will welcome people from other countries and from around the country.
That's fascinating. And I want to end with a question I think that's great to wrap this up with. I'll read the whole question here, and then whoever wants to chime in, please do. The work of this administration is admirable in moving us forward. Other states have done so over the years as well. North Carolina comes to mind. What will happen when this administration is done and same folks are getting and new folks are getting elected to the state and local offices? How do we prevent a new administration from changing everything again, like we seem to do here in Michigan every 4 to 8 years with a lot of policy issues? Is this something that we have to try to find more bipartisan support for, or make some sort of long-term commitment to? Anyone?
Just a real quick answer to that is civic engagement. People need to engage and be talking to those candidates and to people who will support their views. And, we may get, that will modify whatever positions new administration may take.
Agree with Frank. I think when you think about, what continues to move policy and good policy and wise investments forward it is really Michiganders themselves. And so continuing work that many organizations around the state are doing to increase access to those big decision-making, access for average Michiganders, parents, families to be part of that decision-making, to have input in them, to inform those decisions, really, really critical. And also to inform more Michiganders of what's actually happening and giving them the chance to participate in those decisions.
Thank you so much. And this has just been a fascinating conversation. And my hope, and I think I'm not going too far out on a limb here to say my expectation is this is the first of many conversations on this issue. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Neil for some closing comments.
Thank you, Ron. That was just a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and important points were raised by all the speakers. I especially appreciate that the discussion was not just about population or growth for growth's sake, but focused on issues of quality of life and a strong focus on equity. Those are such important parts of the conversation, and we're going to continue having those and further engagement on this in the coming months. So I want to bring us to a close with a couple of thank yous. First, thank you to you, Ron, and to Bridge Magazine for hosting and guiding us through this important discussion today. The Bridge website already has a story and some analysis available, so I encourage everyone to go to their resources and dig in deeper. I also extend a deep appreciation for our just wonderful, amazing panelists, Amber Ariano, Susan Corbin, Frank Edowicz-Gishek, Gabe Rodriguez-Garriga, and Jalone White-Newsome are just a fantastic panel, and all of whom do incredible work every day to help move Michigan forward. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to Ani Turner at Alterum and Eric Lufer at Citizens Research Council and their teams, who did an amazing amount of work in creating the research and the documents that go with this project. Alterum and CRC are Michigan institutions that provide us with the right data and information to help us all make informed decisions. Thank you also to Fenton Communications, led by Paul Hernandez, for the hard work in making sure the right information gets to the right hands at the right time. A huge thanks to the Governor's Office Foundation Liaison, its staff, and its advisory cabinet for its facilitation and leadership throughout this process. And finally, I again thank all of the funders for providing the financial resource and the partnerships that are so fundamental. As funders, we all join together to support nonpartisan research with the intent of informing sound policy and investment decisions by both the public and the private sectors. We believe that this nonpartisan research is essential to inform decisions that will support Michigan's residents and help them to thrive. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. We appreciate you being here and we appreciate your interest. Now is the time to act. Thank you all.